Freeing of the rotor. The motor is jammed means majorly the rotor faces are touching any of the inner face of the rear or front flange. To free the rotor, first hammer lightly the rotor shaft from the front with the help of a plastic mallet and try to rotate the rotor with hand. If doesn't work, then increase the hammering force gradually to reasonable level. Then try and check to rotate the rotor with hand. If it doesn't help, that means we need to hammer it from the back. For that, open the screws of the rear cap and remove the rear cap to access the end of the rotor at the center. Take a smaller pin than the rear end dia of the rotor. Hold it at the center of the rotor and hammering same way as done in the front. Then try and check the rotor to rotate with hand with help of a small cap tool. By hammering from the front and the back one by one, if the rotor would be sticking to any of the internal side of the rear or the front flange, it will be free to rotate. And if still this issue of jamming persists, then you need to open the motor to see any parts inside like spring, bush, rotor blades are broken to jam the motor. Dismantling of 4VM motor. First, open the backside screws of the rear cap along with the washers. Remove the rear cap. Remove the screws of the rear flange. Put a pin into any hole of the screws in the rear flange and the housing. Then remove the rear flange with the help of a puller. Remove the shim from the face of the housing. Now open the front flange. To open the front flange, remove its screws from the front flange. Hammer the backside of the rotor that will remove the front flange and the housing from the dowel engagement. Now take away the housing. Remove the rotor blades and the springs and bushes from the rotor and check them carefully whether they are broken or not. Remove the rotor shaft from the front flange on a small press. Remove the internal circlip or the returning ring from the front of the front flange. Remove the oil seal and the front bearing from the front flange with the help of a pin on a small hand press. Assembly of 4 VM motor. Before starting assembly, we need to check the rear and the front flange. Cut. Or any fresh knots. Take a polished paper of grit 320 on any flat wooden or metal surface and grind the flanges. See, while grinding this way, the face of the flange should remain square to the polishing surface. Fit the bearing into the front flange with the help of a hand press. Assemble the rotor in the bore of the bearing which we have fitted in the front flange with the help of a hand press. Now, before moving further, first assemble the springs. There are three parts of spring: one spring, two thin wire, three bushes. Put the thin wire into the bore of the spring and will pass through. Then put one end of this assembly into the hole of one bush and other end into the other bush. Now put the springs into the two holes provided in the rotor one by one. Then put the blades into the rotor slots. Now put the dowel pins on the face of the housing. Then put the shim on the housing. Then assemble the housing on the rotor and flange assembly. And see the dowel pins of the housing fit into the dowel holes on the flange properly. Hammer the housing from the top so that the housing face matches the front flange face. Then fit the screws to the front flange to clamp it on the housing. Rotate the rotor with hand to check the assembly is free or not. On the other side of the housing, put a shim accurately so that the dowel holes on the shim match the dowels on the housing. Note that there are no dowels on the rear side. Assemble the rear flange on the housing with help of screws. Tight the screws loosely. Now fit bearing in the rear flange and the rear end of the rotor shaft on the hand press. Now rotate the rotor with hand to understand that the assembly of rotor, flanges and housing is done well or not. Again tight the screws little more and check for the freeness. As there are no dowels, try to bring the rear flange in the center line of the assembly by hammering the rear flange square to the axis of the assembly with the help of plastic mallet. If you find the rotor is rotating freely, then final tight the screws of the rear flange. Then once again check finally whether the rotor is rotating freely or not. Now fit oil seal from the front in the front flange and fix it with the internal circlip. Fit the sealing O-ring onto the groove of the rear cap and fit the rear cap into the rear flange. Fit the screws to clamp the rear cap to the rear flange. Finally, check the freeness of the rotor with a cap. Fit silencer into the outlet. Put the key into the key slot.